Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel, Estelle of Imladris. I am Kai, I use he, they, and she pronouns, and you are back for another exciting episode of Seems Right, my show about storytelling and costuming and where those two things intersect, and how they're kind of the same thing in reality. To kick off our show, let's start with the world that we live in. It is a dark time to be a marginalized person. If we're honest, it has been for a very long time. It is important that we reach out to each other, to community, to build meaningful and lasting ties outside of establishments, governments, or faceless digital spaces. Part of why I started this channel was to offer free information and education for those who want to remove systemic, personal, or financial barriers that would keep this from being accessible, because I believe the only way forward is together. Thank you for being here, but also I urge you to find one person or more and connect with them. Be there for each other. Community is how we will be here long after this era of darkness passes, just as we have always been. And about the era of darkness that we live in, it is a very dark time, as I said. In caring for each other, we also must not forget the world that we live in. We should fight for the freedom of those oppressed around the world, especially those facing genocide and violent oppression. I stand with the people of Sudan, the DRC, Palestine, and all oppressed peoples of the world and urge you not to forget them in this time of hardship. But it is also important that we do things for joy, that we lift up those who need us, but also each other. Because things are hard, and I think that the best thing we can do is be there for those that we can be there for, and sometimes that is through storytelling and joy. So if you've enjoyed my streams, please consider following, and if you're able to, subscribing. I'm an independent content creator, and all of your support helps me continue to tell stories and talk about all of this stuff to make your worlds richer, brighter, and more personal. So I appreciate everyone being here for the stream, for all the follows, any subscriptions or tips or anything that you might be able to offer. That is goes entirely towards my sustained ability to do this. Thank you for the hydrate. I remembered my water this time. I had a really chaotic week with my computer last week. And because of the support that I've received from this channel and from some of the other streaming work that I do, I was able to fearlessly go forward and buy the things I needed to make sure that my computer was more stable, so that hopefully it stops randomly turning off. It has survived multiple streams now, and I think we've done it. So extra shout out to my brother who came and helped me to make sure that my computer was going to be stable going forward, but also to all of you, because computers are expensive, especially ones that do all the things. So thank you 1,000 times, and your perpetual support helps me do this kind of stuff and helps me stay, I don't know, online and keep the lights on. All right, channel announcements. As I said last week, I have been uploading all of the content from this channel over time over onto YouTube as well, on the strange, very similar but not quite the same screen name of Estelle-of-Imladris, because YouTube is being strange. But if you enjoy this and you're worried about the VODs falling off, don't you worry. It's over on YouTube too. So go check that stuff out, share it with your friends, listen to me scream about being a little guy, over there as well. And I think that's all of the announcements. Before I get into the stream, because we are going to be talking about fantasy costuming, and specifically we will be talking about fantasy as, people like myself might mostly consume it in its initial form, at least, which is very Eurocentric, like traditional Western fantasy. So additional content warnings for today include colonialism, imperialism, real-world religions, war both real and fantasy, systemic inequality, systems of oppression, and Orientalism. On top of my usual channel content warnings, which includes lots of swearing, because I swear. I occasionally will talk about snakes, because I have one, and some of the other things. So if at any point in time you want to check out the content warnings, like Nightbot just, or that, thank you, AV Inspector for queuing those up. And then there's also another one specifically that will auto-populate with the specific ones for today. So yeah, let's get into it. Let's talk about fantasy costuming. So as I said at the top of stream, Azra, before we do that, I get to show people dice. I'm normal about dice. I am. Okay, so, and as you asked, I have answered, and there is now a cool dice Corvid point redemption. Okay, so these ones are hard to fish out because they're in the back of my little dice tray down here. It's happening though. I have some of them, most of them in my hand. There's so many of them. How did this happen? And they make good noise. Because dice need to make good noise. So these are my bloodstone dice. Let's see if I can get them in front of the camera without punching my microphone. I can't. Failure. So these are real precious, like semi-precious stone, bloodstone dice. I got them on a Kickstarter from the woodworking company Talon and Claw a couple of years ago now, with a beautiful dice box that they're supposed to live in, but they don't because they live on my desk. And I love them because bloodstone is just such a cool natural stone. I love the colors of it, and the vibes are immaculate because it's bloodstone. And they have gold lettering, but even like the opacity, because I think there's a level of quartz, if I remember correctly, inside of bloodstone, or at least there is in this, because there's these like clear little moments in there that I really like. Obsessed with them. And as I said before, they make great noises, and so I actually use them a lot to roll NPCs for my D&D home game, because they have a 4d6 set inside of the larger stone set. So thanks for that redeem, Azra. And keep on getting those points, keep on getting cool dice for me to show you. Eventually, I'm going to have to circle back on some because I'm making plans to make a little dice viewing station that I'll be able to cut to so you can all see my dice better. But in the meantime, yeah, we're working on the dice cam. It's happening. Just, I also have to have a clean desk that isn't in constant chaos. Oh my gosh. So, let's talk about fantasy costuming. On that note, and I have some very fascinating things that I think are fun to get into, at least for me, to talk about today. So let's do it. So I'm going to bring us over to this view. Look at that. Fantasy costuming, a survey into the foundations of modern fantasy. So let's talk about scope before we go too deep in, because fantasy is a massive genre. Fantasy is a genre that is inclusive of everything from folklore and fairy tales to there's a lot of like modern fantasy. Technically, like vampires and all that stuff also fall under like supernatural fantasy. Fantasy is a massive category. So to kind of bring it down a little, I'm going to talk about the scope of what I mean when I'm talking about fantasy costuming as a limited entertainment media genre, especially from a Western perspective. So I do love a PowerPoint. The scope of modern fantasy as we understand it for what I'm talking about today is fantasy as laid by the foundations of the 1800s forward, and mostly revolving around then the hinge point of modern fantasy, which is J.R.R. Tolkien's work, C.S. Lewis, the people who wrote what are essentially the pieces of media that would become things like A Song of Ice and Fire series, The Wheel of Time, Dungeons and Dragons. They're all very Eurocentric in that way, but there are lots of derivative media based off of those things, as well as other media inspired by them that have branched into more diverse and global cultures. So we're going to start with a lot of talking about what where this kind of falls in what we're talking about when it comes to like tabletop, because obviously Dungeons and Dragons is covered under that. This will include things like major actual play, things like Fantasy High and Critical Role, and all of that as well, because they also include touchstones from this media. So buckle up. We're going to really get in there. It's going to mostly be European, medieval, and archaic based fantasy, because that is the genesis of a lot of these, which is why I'm specifically talking about, hey, there's going to be some real world religion, because most of the source material from all of that is based on Christian cultures. Okay, I'm trying to see, what are you all talking about? Okay, steampunk is a subgenre of science fiction, because it is what if science was different. Yeah, so we're talking a little bit about Arcane. Arcane has an interesting blend, and modern fiction tends to hybridize a lot of genres, but in the broad spectrum, most people see science fiction and fantasy as like the two big genres outside of drama or comedy. But none of those are clearly delineated. All genres, as with most things, are not entirely mutually exclusive. So things like Arcane, it's a science fiction fantasy set in a fantasy world. Versus things like Star Wars, which is a science fiction world with a fantasy spin. Those are other problems. I'm talking today about worlds with things that you can define down as like magic and the world building around things like mages, the use of magical ability as the primary driver of, or magical power, object, etc., as the driver of the story. And let's get a further into it. Okay, so most fantasy draws on both the familiar and the unfamiliar, and the place that those two meet tend to be where magic plays a role in the story. So one of my favorite examples to talk about is The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz is a fantasy. And its use of the familiar is so easy to talk about because it is clearly delineated as, rural 1930s America. Dorothy is on a farm in Kansas. You can name all of the proper nouns that are familiar to a Western American audience. And so the magic, the unfamiliar part of it, has kind of a whimsical fairy tale edge to it, where there is a speaking lion, a living scarecrow, a man entirely made of tin. And the stylings of those things are all framed around, the movie was made in 1934 and finally released in like 1936 or something like that. By the way, The Wizard of Oz is wild that movie exists. It is in fact based around other media, but the actual movie is what I'm talking about, because the visual representation of this is so iconic to, again, fantasy, but also really easy to explain what I mean when I'm talking about real world familiar and the unfamiliar. So the merging of things like a medieval knight and an oil barrel becomes the Tin Man. A kind of foppish man and a lion becomes the Cowardly Lion. And these are iconic entertainment images of the era. So like the heavy eyeliner and things like that all kind of play into this like caricature of a 1930s man, but with then layered on all the lion stuff. I love him. I love all of them. And the cultures that are mostly shown in The Wizard of Oz are either very American. They're all wearing like 3-piece suits and things like that, because all, again, from the perspective not only of the storyteller outside of the... We're going to get into Diegesis. Okay, so diegetic and non-diegetic are terms often used in film theory and media studies. Diegesis is the world of the story, so entirely existing within the lore. And then the non-diegetic are the things that happen because it is a piece of media that was created as art or as product, any of those things. So both for in-universe diegetic reasons and non-diegetic reasons, thank you for the follow, the world of The Wizard of Oz is very colored as 1930s Americana. The out-of-universe reasons are, it's the 1930s, and you do what you know, and sometimes what you know is three-piece beautiful suits with strange silhouettes. The in-universe version is not only as Dorothy from the 1930s, but also the wizard fell into Oz from Earth. And so a lot of his touches in the world are also what he likes, because he was a circus guy. So he had a deep love of very, like, theatrical circus clothing and things like that. So they're all over Oz. And so both the real world touchstone of Kansas, America, 1930s, and this whimsical, fictionalized, almost fairy tale, kind of like Aesop's Fables level fairy tale world, become the visuals of The Wizard of Oz. Now take that, and we're going to just kind of like slowly extrapolate it out to all other kinds of fantasy media. The real world cultures tend to be, in reality for fantasy, mostly European ancient cultures. We're talking like medieval fiefdoms in Europe, or even older. There's a deep nostalgia in especially like the Knots and the 2010s of the like clan eras of Europe, which is sure, I guess. There's also a huge obsession with ancient cultures that has come in a lot more recently, all of which are portrayed with a fantasy edge. This is not to say that mythology and religion are fantasy, but this is to say that they are treated in this context as an element of the fantasy. And then another thing is a pastiche of nostalgia and modern aesthetics. So that's basically what I was just talking about The Wizard of Oz, that pastiche is to like lovingly borrow a visual that is both like directly taken from something, but also like a reference to it. So, gosh, what's a really good example? Like anytime using The Wizard of Oz then to extrapolate in pop culture, anytime you see glittery red shoes, you immediately go like Wizard of Oz, because that's the thing that's been planted in the like larger societal zeitgeist now, is that red glittery shoes are the Wizard of Oz. So if you see a character in another piece of media wearing them, you're going, she's Dorothy, without even thinking too hard about it. And the practice of then like laying in that reference with visual touchstones or artistic touchstones. So like one of the most common uses of pastiche is for directors for film and television to directly repeat styles of shots and things like that. So I was just watching the season premiere of The Last of Us. No spoilers, but there's a shot that they use that is a clear direct reference to Sergio Leone Western movies in an entirely out of context situation that gives it the tone of a Sergio Leone movie. It's very cool and it's very subtle, and it really tickled me to the point where like I turned to Lena, my roommate, and I was just like, wow, I can't believe they just did that. So that is the general thing. We're gonna have so many more examples. This is a show of examples and me gushing about it. And also, actually, before I move on, part of the other thing is that welcome to Fantasy Week, actually, because this is the kickoff of 2 streams for this week entirely about fantasy, where I'll be talking about fantasy world building and specifically like Eurocentric fantasy as interpreted through media. So today we're doing kind of this big overview and talking about why fantasy costuming is the way it is, how it has evolved and changed. And then on, thank you, I will hydrate. and choke on my water. I know how to drink water. I don't. That's a lie. On Wednesday, then, you can come back, and I'm going to be starting a brand new playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3, a game that I love. And I invite all of you to join me in the creation of our Tav, the player character within the story. And help me decide their ancestry, their class. I'm going to put together and talk a little bit about like how I also just play RPGs in general, because this is actually, I just think, a fun little like way to also show character building and like exercising that muscle of character choices and character building in other media. Because when I build a Tav, they have a whole ass backstory, and I play the game accordingly. And so we're going to do that for our Tav. And so I also, there's options in there to vote for kind of personality archetypes and things like that. So please go fill that out. Obviously, I also get a vote, but I've put pretty much every option in the game in there of things you can choose, including also who to romance, which I can't guarantee because I've been historically very bad at actually romancing the people I intend to romance in this game, and I end up accidentally romancing Gale of Waterdeep again. Anyways, that's for Wednesday. But fill that out and come back on Wednesday, and I'm going to get deeper into not only fantasy costuming in Baldur's Gate, but talking about fantasy costuming thus in Dungeons & Dragons as a whole. And yes, the plot of Wizard of Oz is basically an incredible D&D prototype for an adventure. I love the conversation of the Wizard of Oz as Dungeons & Dragons. I personally have had this conversation multiple times, and I have huge opinions about it. But we're not going to get into it because I will derail this whole stream about it. Okay, so let's go back to our presentation. One of the other big things that is a recurring thing in most fantasy is idealized mythologies or folklore. So some of the best fantasy out there, even modern from around the world, has ties to folkloric tradition or mythology or both. So like pretty much every creation in Miyazaki has ties to Japanese folklore, Japanese belief in naturalism, which is Shinto. There's huge ties to all kinds of other like European traditions as well, partly because of the source media for things like Howl's Moving Castle. And so this is like idealized mythology of what these things are. And this also includes things like Percy Jackson, Epic the Musical. There's a lot of idealized versions of how these religions looked. And then often they're renamed, reshaped, retitled. Dungeons and Dragons, especially early D&D, did a lot of this, thinking about religion, mostly written by people who've only ever experienced monotheism in a pantheon, multi-deific world. But this is getting into the like Christian-centric side of it as well, which we'll also get into. And you'll notice that some large, I say from a Western perspective, large pieces of fantasy media either have a lot of presence of either religious iconography or religious figures or none. So even though there are deities in Middle-earth, they're almost never brought up in any of the media, even though Tolkien was Christian, versus literally his friend and contemporary C.S. Lewis basically made Jesus lion. So they kind of have a Christianity is omnipresent in these pieces of media. Like there is, even though it's a multi-deific pantheon in Middle-earth, there is still a highest god above all other gods called Enua. And he then created all of the other gods. It's a whole thing. But you'll notice that, again, it is then centered around a singular religious perspective, a singular god. And then there's other things like The Wizard of Oz, where there's just, they don't really have gods as far as the, like, movie is concerned. The closest thing they get is a very powerful wizard and their respect and fear of magic and witches. And that's it. And then you can get into the wicked of it all, where it's just more of that. They don't have church. They don't go to temple. There's no like, you don't see any kind of religious structure, religious practices within the world of Oz. And so it's that's a whole thing. But basically, like, know that most fantasy in Western culture roots itself down into like Nordic myth, Greek myth, some variation of Christianity, a Christian perspective on Nordic myth or Greek myth, or I refuse to call Roman mythology its own thing. So there's that. There's a lot of really gross misinterpretations of all of these ancient practices across all of fantasy media. So that rant aside, that I can go on forever. A lot of it is also dependent on antiquated societal structures, things like feudalism, serfdoms, fiefdoms, vassals, lords. Anytime you hear someone talk about fantasy, one of the like first things that you hear is someone using Middle English, which is not Old English. Old English is barely discernible as English because it's basically Norse. Middle English, or using terms like hail and me lord and all of that stuff, because it is, when people think of fantasy, they often actually think of specifically feudal Europe. So knights, princesses, dragons, all that, feudal Europe. There are really hilarious interpretations of dragons, even in like medieval illuminated manuscripts and things like that. They were obsessed with them, and then we became obsessed with them culturally as well, even now. And then it's also largely centered around warfare, partly because there was just a shitload of war back then. I used to know at least like the time frame of like 15 major conflicts, and I'm like, it's all now like from like basically the fall of the Roman Empire, and even then that was a war, to almost the Industrial Revolution. There's just like a bunch of infighting and small wars in these regions. And a lot of it is just two people who really hate each other. It's real weird. But you'll notice a lot of fantasy then has armor and all kinds of sport around fighting and warfare. And a lot of them even have things like industrial complexes of war. And some of that is on purpose. So if you didn't know, pretty much all of J.R. Tolkien's work is deeply anti-industrial war complex. He was in World War I. It very much so marked all of his work. It is the reason why all of his work is so sad, and probably why I like it so much, because he fought in World War I and left that hating war, hating industrialization of war, and because so much of modern fantasy is based around the works of Tolkien, that has become inherited as part of the legacy of fantasy. It's a lot of either pro or anti-war, and do you fight in the war for your lord, and what does it mean to fight? We're still talking about... Oh my god. See, Wizard of Oz. This might be a fun thing to do in the future, is just get really into it, because I have liked the Wizard of Oz for maybe too long. Okay, so... Huge rant about warfare and all that aside, let's get into what it looks like now. So I've mentioned some of these examples. Now we're going to look at them. So here are 4 iconic, what I consider like huge pop culture touchstone moments in fantasy. The Wizard of Oz. Even from the back, you know exactly who those people are if you've seen The Wizard of Oz. If you haven't, you should watch The Wizard of Oz. No judgment, but also, it's a huge cultural touchstone that if you consume any Western media or even like global media at this point, there's lots of references to it pretty much everywhere. Outside of even Wicked, there's just like so many. So yeah, the Cowardly Lion, Dorothy, the Tin Man, and the Scarecrow, all in a line right there. Off to go see the wizard. And one of the things to look at is that even their colors are still that like Kansas farmland that you believe would be victim of a tornado. Another thing to think about with Wizard of Oz is that part of the imagery of it is so romanticized, even the Kansas of it, even though that is in black and white, because A, that's how they made films back then, but B, there is a deep longing for this to be something beautiful, but they couldn't honestly show farmland Kansas without making it entirely saturated with things about the Dust Bowl. There are so many small little things of, oh, the people who made this survived the Dust Bowl in just the little bit of real world within the Wizard of Oz. And so you take that logic and you look at the characters and the costumes in Oz, and kind of put Dorothy's, lenses on, and in the diegesis of the world, she is going from a place that had so little when she was growing up to a world of plenty, splendor, riches, and beauty. And the world is literally in color for her now. And still, the Scarecrow is in very sensible, like, farmland clothes. Even, like, the Tin Man is weathered and a little bit, besides the rust and all of that stuff. And the Cowardly Lion is not, like, it's very hard to make fur look naturally matted the way that they did in this movie. And they styled it like it was a wig. It's so beautifully done, but they wanted it to look like it was matted and then cleaned. And they really, like, went into, like, these people lived through something just to get here, because Dorothy lives through something just to get there. And it's just the nice touchstones. So I'm calling this up because in the next slide, you will see, like, reality has become a touchstone for fantasy costuming. Because what did I say in the Dirty Laundry stream? Dirt, grime, and aging are what make things real. And even in 1939, when The Wizard of Oz was released, they understood that, even though in 1939, a lot of things were, like, pristine and beautiful and, like, handmade just to immediately go on camera back then. So the next one, I included it partly for me for nostalgia, but also to show the growth of, and not growth of, interpretations of J.R. Tolkien's work. So this is the Rankin Bass The Hobbit movie from 1977. I know how to read. And here we see Gandalf, Bilbo. I can never tell them apart, actually. I'm not even going to try. And then the dwarves of the party in The Hobbit. It's been so long since I've watched this. It is deeply chaotic. Rankin Bass Tolkien animation gives me hives a little, but it exists. It is a touchstone for a lot of people who wrote Dungeons and Dragons. It is a touchstone for a lot of people who have liked Tolkien for as long as I have. It exists, and you'll notice that the clothing is so simple. They all are dressed in really simple, like, boxy tunics, just like they look like in the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon, just like how they dress all the characters in Thundercats, except for the women. There is one fantasy shape, which is Saki tunic in the 70s, with limited exception, but, and also then directly underneath it to compare to another interpretation of dwarves, 1937 Disney Snow White, the seven dwarves there, again, all kind of depending on a very Eastern European interpretation of gnomes and dwarves. And they all also wear basically the same thing as the Rankin Bass dwarves. So 40 years later, costumes for specifically dwarves in animation haven't changed. Because that is as far as fantasy of, like, visually evolved in larger produced media. They just didn't diversify it. And the last one, the most modern thing on here, is another one that we'll kind of get into about kind of the, like, sexyifying of the genre, which is Labyrinth. in which if you haven't seen Labyrinth, you're missing out on David Bowie contact juggling and wearing very tight fall front breeches. And a lot of puppets. There's a lot of puppets. Labyrinth also features some of the most exquisite costumes of the 1980s for fantasy. And so many of them. We were talking in a previous stream about characters that use like cartoon logic and wear the same thing every day versus people who change clothes. One of the things that I really like about Labyrinth that a lot of other 80s fantasy movies did not do is that they do change clothes. They change clothes at important moments. They change clothes to show passage of time. They change clothes because they're extra. Looking at Jareth here, David Bowie's character, who just changes clothes. I'm looking at you talking about the D&D party. Don't you worry. Yeah, I could listen. We might have to do that because I really like talking about that kind of stuff. Future things, talking about the Wizard of Oz and D&D. I love that stuff. Okay, so these are 1937 to 1986 touchstones of fantasy media, and this is not an exhaustive list. Obviously there's so many other things that could go in here, everything from The Princess Bride, there's so many. I don't even know why I started to try and list them all. Willow. It's a impossibly long list of basically like pre-1990s, like 2000s fantasy media. And part of it is something to look at all of these is media and technology. So The Wizard of Oz is a revolution in filmmaking, not only because it's beautiful and a big, seriously taken genre story, but also it was the first black and white and color movie. And so many people who saw it, the very first time they ever saw color film was watching The Wizard of Oz. And so that technology then allowed them to play with big color and call it the Emerald City. Because you could call it the Emerald City, but it kind of loses its meaning if it's all black and white. So now you can say the Emerald City and show them a green city in the distance. And, you know, as far as it's not The Hobbit, but Rankin Bass also did The Lord of the Rings that has rotoscope in it. And there's a lot of it. There's a lot of rotoscope in it. If you don't know what rotoscope is, it is real world images turned into flat silhouetted animation. And they use it to show a lot of the big fights and things in The Lord of the Rings for Rankin Bass, because even illustrating massive armies was a technological like beast, because they had to hand draw everything. So in the era of Snow White, you'll notice that there's never more than the Seven Dwarfs, Snow White, and like one other moving thing in a scene is a tall order for an animator. And so they didn't have huge scenes that weren't matte paintings of crowds, because there was a lot of work. And so when Rankin Bass had to tackle the huge battles in The Lord of the Rings, they used rotoscope to show serious fighting without having to then animate it. And then with Labyrinth, it was not just the like sexyification of fantasy, it was also the integration of the really beautiful integration. There were other ones before, but specifically having Jim Henson come in and in things like Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, create beautiful puppets that allow for non-human shapes, non-human movement, change the diegesis of what we could see in the fantasy. So the non-diegetic technology becomes a part of the world building, because Jim Henson can make gorgeous puppets that seem real. And it's why, and I'm gonna say something. This is not to crack open this being the sidebar for the rest of the stream, but the technology of Star Wars is a really good example of this as well. It's a contemporary to Rankin Bass and Labyrinth, and the evolution of the original trilogy Yoda into CG Yoda from the prequels into modern interpretations of Yoda, having learned the lesson of, hey, hyper CG from, God, what was that, the knots in Star Wars was not as visually realistic and appealing as puppets that Jim Henson made for the original trilogy. I'm getting there, Mom. So then let's talk about modern fantasy. So this is all, I think, either staples of pop culture or moments in which I could really pull out things to highlight of modern pop culture fantasy. So first of all, obviously, I had to put Lord of the Rings in here. It not only did it change the technology of filmmaking for fantasy, going back to the rotoscope, they made the massive engine that my mother in chat is talking about, the massive engine used in Lion King that made the stampede in Mufasa's death, was then turned up and up and up to create the massive engine used in Lord of the Rings that allowed them to create huge scale combat. So instead of having to rotoscope like 4 guys tackling each other, they could digitally reproduce over and over and over again, like blocks of them to walk across fields. And so if you watch Lord of the Rings now, because they haven't redone them, you can actually kind of chart out the barriers of the repeat pattern of the soldiers on the field, but it doesn't lose its magic, where you can see huge hordes of people walking across the battlefield. And with that, also the costume technology evolved, and the access to interesting textiles and the evolution of the costuming industry to include things like custom weaving textiles, outside of just like reaching out to couturiers and saying, will you make this for us? Because that's how they used to do it in the like early Hollywood era. That's a whole other problem. Whereas the Lord of the Rings was one of the very first times that a effects house was asked to take costuming as seriously as Weta Workshop and Nyla Dixon did for the Lord of the Rings. And so they had a lot of custom woven fabrics. They had a lot of custom made, everything down to buttons, sword frogs. They pretty much custom made everything you see in Lord of the Rings. They did not buy a single thing off the peg. And it changed the expectation from audiences of what fantasy media could look like, because it wasn't just like Pan's Labyrinth is the beginning of that, where they said, what if we make the world more immersive? What if we stop showing people something so familiar? Because a lot of fantasy, and this is still true, and it isn't a knock because you work with what you got, but like a lot of lower budget fantasy or fantasy pre the like 1990s, they would buy things and modify them to kind of make them look fantasy-ish. So there's a lot of like 1950s dresses with interesting trim on them or capes added. Whereas because they were making entirely from scratch, the Lord of the Rings movies have interesting silhouettes, non-Western traditional garment types. They reimagine what that sacky dwarven tunic would look like as an actual tunic on a real adult person. But then there's things like Gandalf, who still basically looks the same with just more texture. And I just think that that's neat too. Sword frog. Oh, that's funny. So above then is the eventual child of that costume logic being, of course, Game of Thrones, which was one of the largest costume productions in television history when it started. It was so big. They made so much stuff from scratch for Game of Thrones, and they tried new textile styles. They hired artisans to do specifically like interesting textile work, including some of the most gorgeous smocking you have ever seen. I'm taking a drink now. Thank you for the hydrate. And they were doing beadwork and all kinds of things that before modern prestige television was unthinkable to do for TV. And when I say to kind of define that term, so there's like primetime TV, which is for those of you who lived in a post-network era only. TV used to be something that you had to sit and watch live. I'm sure you know that factually, but to kind of give you the creep and change, primetime TV used to be the thing that companies would spend the most money on. And so that would be where all the money for the networks, like big TV narrative shows, would go, as primetime half an hour to hour long shows. So this is going to be your Twilight Zones, and Twilight Zone's a whole other thing, but Twilight Zone is basically like what I would consider like the peak of like regular release broadcast network genre media, and they put a lot of money into that show eventually after they gave it no money. Star Trek is primetime network television, or like early Star Trek all the way through to pre-Discovery, because basically it was made to be released at that day and time, and that was it. And then in the streaming world, we started to get this weird middle. So streaming started, and network TV started to die, and prestige TV, so your HBOs, your Showtimes, basically what we think of now as like what most TV is, would start to put a movie amount of money into a big TV show. And that's where things like Breaking Bad came from, I believe. And there's some really good examples from this era, but like a lot of it is good TV that people spent a lot of money on, usually mostly on talent. But HBO specifically was the vanguard of doing things like Game of Thrones, Westworld. There's another one that's entirely slipped my mind. You'll have to forgive me. I started working at Disney during this era, and that's pretty much all I did. And then I watched a lot of primetime TV still. But then in the modern streaming age, prestige shows like Game of Thrones would then be made for networks like Amazon, which is why I have kind of the evolution starting from 2001. Actually, they're a decade apart, which is kind of cool. So Lord of the Rings was the benchmark, and then Game of Thrones came out and took that level of costume detail and world building and put it in a TV show. And then HBO released it on a paid premium channel that you could watch slightly less at the time that it was released. And now in the modern times, we have shows like Wheel of Time, which is another decade later that it came out, though this is a picture from this season that just started a couple weeks ago that's about to end. And they have that level of detail put into it, and it's made more like a movie. So each of these, Lord of the Rings is a movie. Game of Thrones was made like a TV show with the money and thought process behind it like a movie. And now modern streamers are basically made like really long. So in the case of Wheel of Time, 9-hour movies. There's so much to get into on that one. And yes, Outlander is another good example, though Outlander I think is technically a science fiction. I don't know. It's a fantasy with time travel. It's I don't know, but they also took then the model of Game of Thrones, and Showtime did the same thing where they hired some of the best artisans to make costuming in the world, and they like hand wove their own tartans and things like that. Glorious costumes. Let's see here. Chi-squared. Given the tendency for costumes to be made over for other productions, I wonder how many of these outfits we'll see again, or is it less common for period pieces like this? So, interestingly, going back to the evolution of how film and TV is actually made, it depends. So, I'm going to explain this, and then we're going to go on break, and then we're going to come back, and I'm going to talk more about the actual media that I'm showing you. So, costuming for film and television can be put together a few different ways. One of them is made. You can make things, which is what pretty much everything that you see on your screen here was mostly made, with some limited exceptions. For that production, it belongs to the production. A lot of it ends up actually going into production company owned archives these days. So like, also you can't re-rent Frodo's costume from Lord of the Rings. Everyone will know what the hell it is. And a lot of them end up going to collectors, museums. They sell them so that the production can make money back. New Line might have kept a bunch of them. I know that they did because I've seen them in archive for either future use, for reference, for historical, archiving, etc. And they're collector pieces forever. The same thing goes for Game of Thrones. So that's made. And then you can also buy, and there are pieces on maybe none of them that they've bought. Yeah, this is a bunch of made costumes. But, it's very common for people to buy pieces, buy shoes, buy, very simple things that can be then, slightly modified, aged, painted, dyed, etc. to be included. And that tends to also live with the stuff. And then there's rental. And there's this funny thing that I love. There's a Tumblr that I've been following forever that's costumes tracking their reuse through media, because there's only so many costume houses in the world, and there's only so many like good Tudor gowns in this world. There's only so many good Victorian day dresses in this world. And so people like me will watch something and go like, isn't that dress from that thing? And yeah, it probably is, because it's either made by outright or like made and then sold to a costume house, which is where I used to work at a costume house. I used to work at the largest costume house in Los Angeles, Western Costume Company. You've seen things that I helped the process of renting, because it is cheaper, and then you don't have to worry about maintaining it after, to just rent something. The only thing is that then you can't alter it. You can't, dye it. You can't, do harm to it, because then you own it. It is cheaper long term, and then you don't have to worry about what you're doing with it after. You just return it. It's harder to do for fantasy. Like, you'd be pretty hard pressed to rent anything from Wheel of Time to another show. I would say that Game of Thrones and The Witcher have some pretty standard like leather armory things, and like they have really good gambesons in Game of Thrones. I love a good gambeson, and there's so many in Game of Thrones. And what'll happen with like all of the thousands of gambesons from Winterfell in Game of Thrones is they'll put them in a big lot, and if another production is coming through, like House of the Dragon, they'll then sell those gambesons to House of the Dragon internally. It's a financial thing more than anything else. And so then those gambesons go on to live another life at another show that also needs a bunch of big, heavy gambesons. I was working on a project that we bought something like 6 full, like you could probably fit like 6 people per box, 6 boxes of that, of costumes from another movie, and restyled them all for a project that I worked on that I can't get into more detail about because of NDA reasons. But we like bought the whole stock, restyled the whole thing, and you would never know that these were the costumes from this other movie that a bunch of people did see, not sure why, and they were restyled because they were close enough. And then that movie that I was working on kept those costumes and continued to sell them internally to other productions from that company. So it's very complicated. But as needless to say, costumes live very interesting and complicated lives. But the funniest example, because that's always the best one, obviously, of what you're asking about is specifically historical. Historical costumes tend to be reused a lot, especially like really like beautiful 1930s dresses, really cool looking, like every Queen Elizabeth costume you've ever seen, with very limited exception, was probably a rental. Every Elvis costume you've ever seen, with very limited exception, was probably a rental. But there are really cool specific rentals too. But like if someone rented even just like Geralt's leather armor you see here, people would be like, that's the Witcher armor. Just because it's obvious, and also no one's quite built like Henry Cavill. So yeah, that's the strange history of how costumes are cycled, and why it makes it really complicated to make fantasy, because if you're going to be really specific in your world building, you're making very specific garments, sometimes people don't want to rent them again. Like Moiraine's beautiful dress from this Wheel of Time promo picture with the big blue beautiful slits and the like gorgeous metalwork over it, that's real specific. It reads very modern out of context. like now, like 2025 modern. And so like, how do you say like, here's a dress made for someone to do big magic things and stunting in that is so elaborate? How do you rent that again? You kind of don't. Also, because Rosamund Pike is very small. But yeah, so that's a little explanation on that. When we come back, I'm going to talk about some of the influences on the costumes that you see, what makes them look the way they look, and the cultures that inform the storytelling, so that then we can talk about how to reverse engineer that and investigate ways to diversify the, inspirations, how to personalize it for you and your character and your world, and how to kind of look at it going forward, and what to look at when we go into Baldur's Gate. But in the meantime, we're going to take a break. I'm going to go get a snack, pet my cats who are stalking me right now. There's one, my hand just touched Rigby. And we'll be back in 10 minutes. See you then. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Sorry, I'm buried under books now. I brought all of my books in. Cool. So, it is not the end of stream. Sorry. I had a slightly overlong because I got engrossed in books, which we'll get to in a minute. But welcome back. This is another episode of Seems Right, my show about storytelling and costuming. Today we were talking about fantasy costumes, specifically focused on Western fantasy and its evolution through costuming in modern media, focusing today on film and television. And so where we left off, we were talking about, after my fun for me, I hope it was fun for all of you, story about how costumes exist in media and how things get re-rented regularly. And I love playing Spot the Reused Garment. We're going to go back to my lovely PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so let's talk about influences in fantasy and how they become part of the world building, costuming, the lore, all of it. So most modern fantasy is based around European medieval, like a fictionalized version of the European medieval era, post-Roman Empire, pre-Renaissance, sometimes including the Renaissance, but most often pre-Renaissance. And there are obviously exceptions to this, like notably things like pirate movies tend to be set, I don't know, in the age of piracy and not in the medieval era. And there are plenty of fantasy pirate movies, including the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, among 1,000 others. But those are not, they are also derivative fantasy of European history. But today we're talking about slightly earlier, just because I want to get down into the meat of what makes these different and why they're not just historical costumes. Because, like, especially when you get to like Pirates of the Caribbean, it's basically just historical costumes reflavored, whereas more traditional fantasy, I say with heavy quotations around it because there's so many versions. Like, if you haven't, go watch like Sangxia or something like that in China, or Korean fantasies, Japanese fantasy is a whole other thing. There's some really amazing African folklore based, specifically like art, but also there are movies and things based on that as well. There's plenty of amazing Central and South American fiction pieces, and the way that they interpret fantasy is so fascinating. You can see a little flavor of it in movies and stories that have been ported from creators from that region. So like Pan's Labyrinth has a lot of non-American perspective fantasy elements, even though it's very European centric media. Hello, thank you for the sub again. Thanks, Puck. Oh yes, the Wagadu Chronicles is an amazing Afro fantasy D&D setting. I have looked at it. It's awesome. And there's also just like in the TTRPG world, there's such a wider range of backgrounds available, especially when you get into independently produced TTRPGs or ones that are more diverse, like in their singular setting as well. But today we're going to look at ones that are more of like a either very European or become more melting pot as time goes on. Starting with Lord of the Rings again on here, it is very deeply European. The works that were the foundational media for it, all of Tolkien's writing. Tolkien was first a linguist, second a like historian, and third a writer. So a lot of his work is based around that logic. So if you keep that in mind when you look at things like Lord of the Rings, both the movies and the books, you should be able to look at it and go, this is the analog of this in European history, because that's the point. The point was that he was writing an alternative, fictionalized version of the history of Europe. And so the hobbits being very like pastoral France, not an accident. Oh gosh, thanks, Puck. And the languages, and then when it was taken into media, the film interpretations also then draw from these European touchstones, where like Rivendell has a lot of specifically like Art Nouveau French styling, because that's a consistent thing that has been put with that throughout the history of Lord of the Rings media. But also there's a heavy influence of like Florence specifically, like Florentine stuff from Italy. There's a lot of that kind of stuff. And then you go to Rohan, where it's like Norse. It is very like Germanic. It has huge influences from the northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, as well as some like historic like Scottish and things like that in it as well, if I remember correctly. And they put that straight into the costumes. You could literally, I'm gonna pull up pictures in a minute, because I have pictures already open in my lap for something else. And you can see that like the hobbits are wearing, they're not suits. I'll preface this by saying they're not wearing suits. They're wearing something called a sack coat, which is basically a suit. So I'm not lying when I say they're not suits, but also they're real similar. They're wearing sack coat style garments. And one of the things that I wanted to get into today was talking about the evolution specifically of menswear in the era that most fantasy is inspired by, because it's something that fascinates me deeply and I think will inform some interesting world building. So lapels. Lapels are a thing that tell you so much about an era, because lapels have not always existed. And when someone describes a medieval garment as having lapels, I wince, because medieval garments did not have lapels. They had something called reavers. And this is not me being, picky about the terminology. They're very different, and here's why. So the Hobbit's garments all have lapels. They have straight up, like seamed, folded, pressed and creased to be pretty much like they could be turned up and closed over, and they would have just a little fold down collar if they did that. That's most suits. Suits today still have that. They're made with the idea that if you take a suit coat, I should get a suit coat to display this. I might do that in a minute. Again, I'm under books right now. If you take a suit coat and fold the lapels over, you'll notice that it actually closes across the chest. You'll get that nice, like what people largely associate with science fiction, asymmetrical front closure. It was originally engineered to do that. That's why there's a buttonhole in the collar of most suits. Even if the buttonhole doesn't go to anything anymore, it was actually made to close over. And then it would leave it with a small turn down collar, which looks like a shirt collar, essentially. Like if I closed my shirt over, even though it's a pattern and you'll never know the difference, it would look like this. hanging over a suit. And that is a lapel. Now, they are structured internally very specifically. They tend to be pressed a certain way. There are most of the evolution of men's fashion post-Industrial Revolution is about the size, positioning, and amount of lapel. Oh, thanks. I love a button-down shirt. I love a fun one. I love a nerdy one. This one's all of the above. So this is supposed to have what I'm looking for on it, and it's not having it, and I'm getting annoyed. There's one. Okay, so that is a lapel. Now, a reaver, you would think, is right next to it, right? If I'm saying that they look the same and most people refer to them as the same, the difference between a lapel and a reaver is that a reaver, I'm going to show you kind of a bad example, and I'm going to see if we can find a better one. So this heavy, this woman right here in this blue dress, she has ermine reavers. And what that means is the garment is cut long, not pressed and folded, but actually cut long enough that it folds over naturally there. So my best example of this, and the one that sets me off every time, I'm gonna close her. I'm tired of looking at her. I'm gonna pull it up, my other window. And this is not me knocking anyone. I just need you all to know that there's a difference. So, nope. A new tab. Thank you. Nope, that's not what I wanted. Why are wikis like this? That's as good as I'm getting. Okay, so Critical Role. The actual inspiration for the shirt that I am wearing, because this is a Critical Role shirt. This jacket. This now many remade, beautiful circus man coat of Molly Muck Tea Leaf does not have lapels. It has reavers. Because the way that the jacket is constructed means that it doesn't have like structured lapels that fold over. It has fabric that just falls. And all of the coats in Critical Role, big ups to them, all from this era have reavers. And it is a statement of technology about the kind of garment technology that is going into the clothing. That's technically a jacket. A coat, not a jacket. So I pull up this one specifically because it is clear references to Renaissance, late medieval and Renaissance clothing. And the reavers on it give it the look of a modern jacket. But people did make long robes. Yes, long robes of this style often. So I have more to show you from this very heavy book of costume history. So, robes, also known as gowns, for the longest time were the same thing. And if you really want to see me go on a tear about this, I was the costume history specialist on the episode of the Try Guys, in which the Try Guys wear dresses, to specifically talk about how robes and gowns were the same thing for a very long time, and men used to wear gowns often. So, these guys, right here, heavy book, why? Are wearing robes with reavers. Robes with reavers. Come on, camera, do it for me. Yeah. Very similar in style to Molly Muck's coat. God, that book is heavy. It's beautiful, but it's so heavy. Okay. Goodbye, Molly. And I show you that because the technological difference is a statement of time in a world building. So because most of the references in Exandria tend to be Eurocentric, like late medieval, early Renaissance, they tend to stick to things that have reavers and not lapels. There are very few lapels, and the ones that do exist tend to be from cultures like Whitestone that have a more like modernist European foundation. So Whitestone also is home of clockmaking and heated streets and all kinds of other more modern than your average Renaissance European town. And I say all of this not because it's actually super important that you know the difference between a lapel and a reaver. It's important to me, but it's not actually, you know, in the wider world, no one's going to ding you for not knowing the difference. But it is that a structured suit with, there's actually horsehair in most structured suits that have reavers, that have, lapels. These books, they're squishing me. I'm moving them. They're squishing my brain because they're so heavy. I'm holding all of these in my lap. Oh. Hold, please. That's better, and I'm even taller in my chair. The reason I say all of this is that to have what is called hymo, the internal lining of a suit that gives it such structure, and things that are required to create a real lapel, including interfacing, all kinds of specialized suiting, stitching, are not required in a reaver. And reavers are actually also on gowns, they're on robes, they're on all kinds of other garments before the suit is invented. And suits, when they were invented, didn't have lapels, didn't have reavers. It is an evolution of menswear that they exist the way that they do now. But the tailoring sciences are the difference there, because you can make a beautiful Renaissance style coat with reavers and know nothing about modern tailoring. In order to make a suit with lapels, there has to be a technological advancement that has been the reasoning for that evolution. Otherwise, it's basically just reavers, which is most fantasy. Most fantasy is just reavers. I just think it's an interesting difference that someone like me would notice, that I think about often. So I thought I would share with all of you. Was a whole 20-minute rant on reavers. Sorry. Okay, back to these examples, because we have them here and they're wonderful. Besides the hobbits wearing, like, basically turn of the century 18 to 1900s suits, we have very traditional looking like robes, and there's a lot of gambesons also in Lord of the Rings, none of them in this picture, and then a lot of like traditional medieval style gowns. There's a lot of them, and then variations on cloaks and capes and robes, which are kind of your standard fare fantasy garb for people who are not in armor. And the only people in armor in this are Gimli and Boromir. Boromir because he pretty much wears the same jerkin and tunic the entire movie, because then he dies. Spoilers for a movie that came out a long time ago and books that came out even longer ago. And it's very factual. Oh, how do you think the presence of magic in a world affect the designs and tropes? God. Versus things like BBC Robin Hood or A Knight's Tale. You're bringing those up just to trigger me. So I say this lovingly. So the BBC Robin Hood, which if you haven't seen, it's Richard Armitage before he was everywhere all the time, as Guy of Gisborne, as Leather Daddy Guy of Gisborne, basically looking like Geralt here. The BBC famously doesn't have big budgets for their costuming, and so you can see things like people fully wearing Uggs in the BBC Robin Hood, even though it's Robin Hood. Yeah, that sounds right, Erica. It's fine. Um, I won't tell you how old I was when I saw that movie for the first time in theaters when it first came out then. The BBC Robin Hood, which came out in like 2006, I want to say. And A Knight's Tale, which is a wonderfully anachronistic, like hyper early 2000s fantasy romp with Heath Ledger and Paul Bettany as Chaucer, and a bunch of other like interesting people doing like fully medieval but like super stylized fantasy medieval story versus like magic. It's the difference between so like I can look at Lord of the Rings and go, okay, they probably use some magic to create some of the textiles in Lord of the Rings. I can suspend my disbelief about like micro knits, because there's clearly some like very fine fabric work, though I think that they didn't really use knits, but like there's some elements that I'm like, that could be achieved through knitting. That would have been technology from magic, but also Lord of the Rings is a pretty low magic world. It would be more things like The Witcher or Wheel of Time, and you'll notice that the more fantastical the magic, the less realistic the garments, which I think is very cool in this group of four. So like Wheel of Time has big TM magic. The main city is surrounding a massive tower where women go to learn magic. So Moiraine here, not only is a lady, so she's always super well dressed, but also is an Aes Sedai, which is a magic user in this world. Thank you for the hydrate. But you'll notice she's wearing fully like fantasy fashion, because she's like that, versus our non-magic user in this group of all the people here. The only one who doesn't use magic is Lan, the guy behind her, my guy, because I love people who don't use magic because I have a problem. And he is wearing more traditional clothes, but he's dressed like that for other narrative reasons. But you'll notice he's at least wearing like a regular robe-like garment. And like again, Game of Thrones, pretty low magic. When you get to more like bigger and bigger magic, so kind of going back to, we were talking about Arcane in chat earlier. Arcane has some levels of fantasy design mixed into very like modern grounded industrialist design. And so when you have people again wearing a lot of suits in Piltover, and even down in Zaun, but less traditional because they're not made in mass production or not made by tailors who make, and that's all that they do. Versus places like Noxus that have a history and relationship with magic. And some of the other kind of implied industrialized things that are meant to mirror magic. So Piltover has a lot of like gears and intricate clockwork integrated into their designs to show that their form of magic is technology. Versus when you do see magic in its uses with spoilers for season 2, there is elements of magic in season 2 that are a lot bigger, and you see cultures that have touchstones in it. They're wearing significantly less realistic clothes because it's magic and you can do whatever the hell you want. And so actually something I wanted to show, do I still have that open? I hope I do. I'm gonna find a tab. You know how it is when you have 1,000 tabs. It must be in this window. It is. So, kind of thinking about Moiraine again, I'm just gonna pull this out. We're gonna go side by side, Moiraine, and so you'll notice also that there's kind of a recurring thing of one of the common ways that people show magic is through kind of more organic looking, hard to achieve things. So this goes into the whole, like, you have to think from the people's making it, the non-diegetic perspective of the creation of the garment. So when Game of Thrones was being made, there was a fashion designer called Issey Miyake who had destroyed everyone's minds by doing things like this. This is early uses of 3D printing. Why won't you let me enlarge? Why are you like this? Anyways, Iris van Herpen is the other one. I was trying to think of who it was. So Iris van Herpen and Issey Miyake. Issey Miyake did it through folding fabric, and Iris van Herpen did it through 3D printing and modeling. But this came out in like right around when Game of Thrones was being made. And so when you look at Daenerys in this, and you think, okay, so someone was inspired by structural, more organic looking design that was wearable, there's a very good chance that this Iris van Herpen line, I was trying to find a very specific one and I didn't find it. Let me see if I can find it really quick. This is a great one, but that's not the one. This one's great. So one of the things that Iris van Herpen's work is super known for is the movement of it. This is another favorite of mine. So this is all achieved through 3D printing. And so when you look at then people making and trying to think of what does fantasy look like, they're looking to things like runway fashion and things like this that have otherworldly qualities, so that when you see it, you go, that's magic, right? That's someone creating magic. No, that's someone who just used very fascinating technology to create incredible... I'm going to mute this. And you can see, like, that one's not 3D printed, but this one is. Oh no, that one's also just cut really well. But you can see, like, it doesn't look real almost. And this is the thing that, this is one of the ones I was looking for. So laser cutting and 3D printing became kind of the language of what does magic look like for a very long time. And it remains this way today, even in things like Arcane and in Wheel of Time. A lot of the more magical looks are what we consider what magic looks like in clothing. And they are more, flashy, or they're less functional. If, like, I were a person walking around, I wouldn't want to wear either of these. I mean, I would look great because these are great looking, but, like, it wouldn't be functional for me to go about my day wearing those. Moiraine's whole job is do magic good and don't die. And so you can imagine, like, she only needs to worry about do magic good. And you can see that, like, we're gonna open this again. Geralt's an interesting case because he has to do both, like, traditional combat, and then he does his Witcher stuff. I haven't watched much Witcher. Sorry, y'all. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of the Locked Tomb also has inspiration from that Iris van Herpen series, as far as just, like, the way that the otherworldly structures kind of look, and it's a way to imagine the necromancy of that world. And there's kind of descriptions in it as well that make me think of that, of Issey Miyake's work, of Iris van Herpen's work. The Issey Miyake stuff is also... where is that one? I had one open. There we go. Of just, like, folded clothes that, again, don't quite look real, even though they are real and they're made. Also, I pulled this up because the blue is obviously the same blue as Moiraine. And it's that, like, hypersaturation mixed with the way that the garment looks not quite real. None of these are like the more recent stuff, but there's one that I was looking for that I did not find. But you can see the structural elements being inspired by what the creators saw as fantastical, beautiful works that otherwise would not be able to be made without magic in these settings. And so yeah, they imagine fashion as the way that they see fashion, as the way that their viewers are going to see fashion. Even if you've never seen any of these runway touchstones yourselves, they had the general response of, wow, that looks like magic. And so they said, okay, well, if that looks like magic to viewers who are consuming this runway, this art, why don't we borrow aspects of that art and put it into ours and say, this is what magic can make? And so it's kind of fashion and costuming and world building have kind of a strange call and response with each other. And it becomes a very strange kind of like chicken egg scenario very often. But I could definitely say with quite a bit of certainty that a lot of the inspiration for especially the Aes Sedai in Wheel of Time, a lot of the stuff from the later Narnia movies were very inspired by runway shows that I can like point a finger at and say it was that. If you watch anything that has a like super kind of gothic tone with beautiful gowns, there's a decent chance it was inspired by Alexander McQueen. This is the language of fashion that then influences these in the same way that it always has. So going back to the Wizard of Oz, the 1930s, that very sweet pastoral dress, the gingham dress that Dorothy wears, was very fashionable and was not at all what someone in her position in life would have probably actually been wearing, because it was so like nice, well made, clean, almost like new. The White Witch is exactly who I was thinking about. Tilda Swinton as the White Witch in Narnia is clearly inspired by, I think Alexander McQueen came first with a very similar look. And so this is the like echo chamber language of fantasy, is also going all the way back to the beginning of my presentation, a pastiche of nostalgia and modern aesthetics. And so you can have the White Witch in Narnia in the movies, played by Tilda Swinton, both being the Snow Queen from Hans Christian Andersen. You can have her being the scary witch as described in the book, and you can have the inspiration of the Savage Beauty Alexander McQueen fashion line all kind of smashed together, and that's how you get that like almost dripping sinister iciness of the White Witch. So this is how costume designers actually create these looks. And Yellow Jackets is cool because it also has huge elements of like, again, that modern edge that someone with a deft understanding of what modernity can look like, and how to make it fictional and how to make it different. I love costume design. And the one of the things to think about for you and for world building, kind of to take it back to using this on a practical level and not just having me info dump at all of you with all of my love of fantasy storytelling, is that like, take inspiration where you get it, because that's how fantasy tends to be made. So the reason I was going into the deep part of where Tolkien's work came from was because then the people who were reinterpreting that for media then looked at those same things, because all of these were made in conversation with the Tolkien estate, who has all of that information, or they're working with people like me who maybe know way too much about it, or both. And so they're going to the same touchstones to try and create media that is resonant with its source. And for you, and this is getting into the like de-Westernization conversation, and I should really bring up my guy, since I referred to him in the background of a picture and it seems like an injustice. You'll hear me talk a lot about Wheel of Time, the TV show. I think it's really wonderful. And part of my favorite thing about it, it is the, I think, most diverse main like legacy fantasy franchise ever made. And they took characters that traditionally have been imagined as people with European ancestry and made them very diverse. The main cast, which is a fluctuating term, because it's an ensemble show. There is one white woman, Rosamund Pike. There is one white man. I don't remember Rand's actor's full name. He's lovely and European. And then everyone else is people of color, and it's a lot of people. Nynaeve is played by a beautiful black woman. Egwene is played by an indigenous Australian woman. And then the one I'm going to pull up, my guy, Lan Mondragoran, who is basically an Aragorn analog in that's really not a good version of that picture, even though I thought it was. Traditionally, you know what? You're getting the whole search page, because then you're going to see previous interpretations of him and what he looks like in the show. This is what Lan traditionally has been imagined to look like. He is in so many ways Aragorn. When they were making the show, they looked at the source material, and for reasons that I think are complicated and of mixed motivation, Lan is symbolized in the books using a samurai helmet. His chapters that focus on him have samurai helmet literally on them. I used to have a sticker of it somewhere on my desk. I don't know where it is now. But he is in the most of the cover art. Here's a cover of one of the last books from the series. He's portrayed as a tall, muscular. He's described in the book as being like very stone-faced and angular. But they don't often actually talk about the color of the character's skin. And when they cast this show and they cast a mixed Korean man, Daniel Henney, as Lan, people lost their whole mind. It was truly wild. But this is Lan in the show. If I can stop getting rerouted, I just want to open the picture. Thank you. And they took the Asian influence of him in the book, where he does wield a very like samurai like sword. His story is very like reclaiming his family's honor with a sword. It's a whole thing. But when they cast Daniel, they then, as the costuming team, started to add Korean and East Asian influence into the costume design process. So all of Lan's clothing is very East Asian inspired and very lovingly blended with both the very European influences of Wheel of Time. And you can see, even just in his basic clothes, which is what this is what he wears from pretty much all of season 1 and most of season 2, is a very East Asian, more like tunic in the style of a lot of especially like lower class Asian people in that region, East Asian people. And there are pieces that have more of the like Korean traditional dress. There's a lovely moment, costuming wise. The actual scene is dreadful and makes me cry, where he is in a moment of grief. And a lot of Asian cultures, actually, one of the ways to like think about decentralizing European and specifically like traditional Abrahamic traditions, their color of grief and mourning is white. And he wears white in that scene. And everyone else in the scene is also wearing white. And it's very profound if you think about that as, oh, my way of thinking about what grieving looks like in a costume is actually not universally true. What does it look like for, you know, for me, I go look at my own ancestry because I have quite a diverse background that I can go and say like, okay, so what do Japanese people wear in this situation? What do my Nordic ancestors wear? What do my, Germanic ancestors wear? Yes. Listen, we had a long conversation about funereal practices. You'll notice that the finale, no spoilers, of Arc 2 of the Chaos Protocol, we really got into our funereal stuff because there's a lot of, hey, guess what color Seer wore in that scene? I'll give that to you. And so by decentralizing our like very Western perspective on what that looks like and what functional traveling clothes looks like, what a nobleman looks like. Wheel of Time has made a very diverse fictional world because there are braiding practices integrated into a culture where there are multiple brown and black women. There are very incredible traditional tattooing practices that have deep resonant feelings with a lot of indigenous tattooing practices in that world that are not what we think of as like Nordic tattoos. They're not Germanic tribes. They're none of that stuff. It is like very there's a lot of like African styling. There's a lot of indigenous styling in the tattooing, and they have people there working with them and saying like, yes, this is tattooing that is, you can see that they did the research of like what is close that it kind of resonates with the idea of it without appropriating like Samoan tattooing. There's a one tattooing practice in the Wheel of Time that to me very much so calls to the Polynesian tattooing practices that I think is very cool. And so when you say like, what does it look like to explore what nobility looks like, what grief looks like, what working people look like, what traditions of markings look like, exploring other cultures can be so fruitful. And again, when you are looking at things like just everyday clothing, drawing inspiration from other just like ideas of how clothing goes together from other cultures is not appropriation. It becomes appropriation when you're like, okay, so my character is going to wear this traditional garment from this culture, and it's mine now. But saying that like non-statically constructed garments, like those very common in South Asian cultures, that's not a problem. Wear, wrapped garments, because wrapped garments are actually a universal like language, because there's plenty of examples of it across the globe. And go be inspired by those things. Yes, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is decidedly a fantasy, but it is specifically a Chinese historical fantasy, so it's why it's not what I'm talking about here today, because it's a whole other language. I am not the authority to speak on the history of Chinese fantasy, because there's so much of it. And it has its own language and lore in a way that is so fruitful. It's like silly Kai confession time before I end this huge fantasy costuming storytelling time, was that it took me until the end of Arc 2 of the Chaos Protocol before I was like, oh man, I don't have any, when I started designing Zeinin, I was like, I don't have any practices of face markings in my ancestry. I'm from mostly European cultures. There is some, but it's like very loosely researched. It's very hard to define. And a lot of the really famous ones are indigenous cultures. So I wanted to be very careful to not take things from especially Native Americans or African tribes or Central and South American cultures in figuring out what Zeinin's markings looked like. And I designed it all, and I was, I felt pretty good about it, and C and I went around and around about it. C. Thomas, the dramaturg, talked a lot about it. And then in the middle of Arc 3, after I already designed Zeinin using my like anti-samurai point of view on what he looked like in the City of Heaven, I realized that I do have that because Kabuki exists. Something that I have studied and looked quite a bit into, Kabuki, no theater, all of that stuff. And I went, no, okay. The detail of the documentation of that exists, and I actually accidentally mirrored it. So you can accidentally discover things too. I accidentally redid my own heritage. Anyways, and yeah, my mom was right. They did do face and body markings. It's just not very well documented as to exactly what those were. So it's very hard to respectfully replicate or not replicate them. Because face markings are makeup and that decays even when you find bodies in swamps. You should look into bog bodies. They're very helpful for historical research. And on that note, I think that's enough from me on that for now. But yes, fantasy costuming, you can always expand your European concepting by removing things like feudalism from your story, concepts based on feudalism, concepts based on then imperialism from feudalism, and colonialism from feudalism. You can decentralize war themes and things like that. You can move away from Norse and Greek and Christian religion points of view, especially when you're depicting polytheistic cultures, because it's silly that in a polytheistic world. You can only be devoted to one god. Looking at you, Dungeons and Dragons. Things like that. What a wonderful thing. Boggs, my beloved. You're right. Oh, we're in the transplanar grief there. Okay. No hate. I started reading that and I was like, nope, I'll cry again. So, that's enough fantasy costuming for now. You can come back on Wednesday as we start to play Baldur's Gate. And I will get really into, you'll hear me rant more about reavers, about armor, about fantasy fashion, and a bunch of other, it says next week. That's a lie. It's now. It's this week. We'll be talking about the costumes of Baldur's Gate, which is the Forgotten Realms, which is the prime universe of most Dungeons & Dragons content, including Honor Among Thieves, even though I don't understand their interpretations of tieflings at all. And it'll be a fun time. We're going to look at the Renaissance inspirations for a lot of the costumes, especially looking at you, Astarion, my beloved. Yeah, it's gonna be a good time. So in the meantime, please, thanks, Puck. The poll is there. You can vote there to influence our tab, and then we're gonna build a character both in the game mechanics and also for us to play the game with together. And it's gonna be really fun, and I cannot wait because I love Baldur's Gate, and this is an excuse to play more Baldur's Gate. And then also this week, where are my notes? I do have them. I've covered my entire screen with windows, though. So, other things. So it came out quietly, but I thought I'd bump just... I did a fun guest appearance, and I was thinking about it earlier today and talking to someone from that. I had such a good time with it, and I don't think I ever plugged it on my show. So, Storyteller Squad, which is a Monster of the Week. It's marketed as, like, Monster of the Week Lo-Fi. They do a really good job. It's a podcast actual play using Monster of the Week. It's modern, like, what if all the cryptids and all of the, like, folkloric stories were all true? And I was in one of their extended universe series, which is one-off shows with new characters set in their world with fun guest players. So I was in one with Latia Jaquise, Ivy from the Crit Awards, and KP of KP fame. It was a really good time. I played the chillest van travel blogger you've ever met, and talked about ghosts. Never happens. Me? So yeah, you can go listen to that wherever you get your podcast, and I'll put a little link to my plug over here. Oh yeah, listen, you're not off topic about the tiefling shade, because you're right. Anyways, we'll come back to that on Wednesday. And then tomorrow you can come and enjoy more of the Fourth Age of our Wounded Warrior Project Stream to Serve at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, where I get to come back as Erland of Mythland, my love letter to the elven lore of Middle-earth, and my sweet beloved shipwright. And then Wednesday, as I've been saying, I'll be here for Baldur's Gate. We're going to have a great time. I'm so excited. And then I'm offline until Saturday, baby, where nothing's happening on Saturday. Don't worry about it. Just kidding. We'll be back on Saturday with more of the Chaos Protocol. After that monumental last stream on Saturday, you can see where these revelations will take Inferno, Nova, and the Journey. Cannot wait. I'm ready to cry more. And then coming very soon, next week, there will be a new episode of Lori's House, which is my Home We Remember actual play that I got to be the game master for over on Tender Vicious Studios, and I highly recommend checking that out. As I said, episode 3 drops a week from Thursday, but there are 2 episodes out now, and just such a love letter to community, identity, and memory in that one, and exploring memory and changing who we are. And then I got a bunch of new stuff in the works that I've just been in constant meetings and working time on. So keep your eyes out, because there's going to be more stuff being announced pretty rapid fire over the next couple of weeks, I think. Yeah, so thank you all so much for joining me. I actually ended on time, unlike when we were doing unpacking and I was rage playing. And I'll see you all on Wednesday. Until then, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon. Bye.